what works and what doesn't. It's kind of the Paul Ryan approach to politics, right? If we do entitlement reform, this many people will be saved on Social Security. If we don't, this many people won't. And that to me is almost, it's a secondary argument. You first have to discuss what is the role of government in people's lives. You first have to discuss what is right and wrong. And we have to reteach that from the most basic level. And so that's going to start with teaching our kids, our own kids, at the most basic level. I have two. I have one that's 2.5 and one that's 6 months. And it's going to start with me teaching them at the most basic level. But it's also going to be challenging the left's feeling of unearned moral superiority. People on the left feel, the things they say are very stupid sometimes, but they feel good about what they're saying. And that's the only thing that matters. Like Bernie Sanders acolytes, it never occurs to them that they're stealing other people's money, that you are voting to literally take somebody else's labor and time from them. Right? They say, oh no, I'm fair, I'm making a better person because I'm willing to give up. Well, no, you're not willing to give up. If you're willing to give up, you just give charity. You're willing for me to give up by taking the government gun, pointing at my head, and saying, me and my friends vote for you to give me your money. Right? You don't get to do that. That makes you an ass. And the fact is that if we don't argue in those terms and force people on the left to confront the roots of their own morality, you're never going to come to the point where we can even have an argument about values. Part of the thing that just annoys me about values, about political discussion, is politics is like an iceberg, and everybody's always discussing the tip of the iceberg, and 90% of the iceberg is underwater. We need to be discussing the stuff that's underwater. Sorry, I have your...
Really, what the point was, was discussing what that root is, and that's why I'm kind of bringing up the belief, or really just the general concept of God in someone's life.
Well, no, listen, if the yarmulke didn't indicate it, I'm a very religious person. So I believe deeply in the basis of Judeo-Christian morality, and that's why on a social level, not on a governmental level, government has no business in this. A free government can only exist when people are moral, right? Everybody from Tocqueville to Adams says this. And so you're going to need churches and synagogues to do a better job of inculcating values in the kids they teach, as opposed to, here's some guitar music and pizza, come to church on Sundays. It's a waste of time, it doesn't teach anybody anything, and they do it at synagogues too, so it's not unique to Christians. And it's ripped the heart out of religion and made it meaningless. And unless religion can regain its footing as a moral arbiter and a speaker for eternal values, then why would anybody waste their Sunday going to church for pizza and guitar when you can stay home and have pizza and not listen to a preacher? Seems a lot better to me. Right? I pray 3 times a day. If I didn't believe there were eternal values behind that, I would certainly not waste my time doing that.
Hi, so I'm someone, my name's Sai, and I swing towards the leftist a little bit, something. But I thoroughly
Thank you for coming. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed your talk. I actually agree with many of the points that you're bringing up. But I have just some questions on some things that I thought. And one of the things you were saying was the government can never truly help. Like you were saying, the government can never make you an NBA player. That line like stuck with me. Mm-hmm. And of course that's true. A lot of things the government can't help with. But the question I wanted to ask was, regardless of what is causing a discrepancy in societies, and many of the leftists believe it's some racial thing that you were debunking, but right. Whatever it is, the two-parent or mm-hmm. any aspect, there clearly is discrepancy in society, and a lot of it's unfair. And you may be right about this. You claim that the government is not the best tool that can help, bridge that gap.
Right.
But so my question basically comes down to, when there's general if there's people that are not getting access to food or water on a regular basis, or mm-hmm. And another thing I fundamentally believe everyone should have for free is access to as much education as they need. Because I personally think access to education is something that can prevent these kind of inequalities happening in society. So all sorts of things like this. Is there anything that anyone here believes everyone has a fundamental right to? What do you think is the best?
My view of rights, just so you understand, my view of rights is that you don't have a right to anyone else's labor or services. So when you say you have a right to education, the problem with that is what you're really saying is I have a right to force a teacher to teach me. You don't have a right to do that, right? It's like when people say I have a right to health care. My wife's a doctor. You don't have a right to go to my wife and say to her, you will now care for me for free. I have a right to free speech because I don't have to impose anything on you to achieve that right. It's my right to be free from your oppression, right? I have a right to keep and bear arms because you don't have a right to take away my right to keep and bear arms. So this is the difference between what the left calls positive rights and what we call negative rights, right? Negative rights are just the idea that you have rights in the absence of government. These rights inhere in you personally, and you don't need anybody else in order for those rights to exist. The problem with it, so I agree that local communities particularly have an interest in education. Right? The way that the founders foresaw this is there were public schools during the founding era, but they were all locally controlled. So the basic idea was the federal government has no place in any of this. You and your friends get together like it's an HOA, like it's a condo HOA, and you all have a bunch of kids, and you decide to pool your resources and hire some teachers, and you have a local community school. The reason that's better is because number one, you know the parents are invested in the kids. Number two, the parents have control over what's being taught to the kids, so it's more in line with their values. And number three, you don't have somebody who's far away telling you what should be taught to your kids. And local education has always been a better solution than federal education solutions. So I'm not talking that there can never be collective solutions to anything, but those collective solutions have to be incredibly well tailored, and the people who are engaged in the collective solution have to give their consent. So, for example, I think that it's unfair. If you're a single person and you decide to live your entire life without having kids, I don't know why it's your job to educate my child. It's my job to educate my child. Right? Parents have the original responsibility to educate. Now, if parents won't do that, that's where charity comes in. Right? That's why you need strong, vibrant social institutions to take over when you have people who are being harmed. Right? Who can't take care of, really not people who are being, people who can't take care of themselves, is a better way to put it. Children, the disabled. You know, that's where you need strong social institutions to fill in that gap.
So if like there's, let's say in a particular society there may not be enough, look, you're basically saying then, even if there's not enough of these social institutions or enough good people or charitable people, because there's a lot of situations where kids are being brought up in maybe these one-parent situations, maybe two-parent situations, but there's just not a good set of values in their house.
Right.
But they themselves, if they live in a society where the society thinks they don't have a right to someone else's labor, then how are these people going to have access to something?
Well, so when it comes to children, I mean, if the parents is not, one of the things that has happened is that social standards have fallen so low that parents in a lot of areas don't care about the education of their kids. That's child endangerment to me. I mean, if you don't care about the education of your kids, then honestly, that's a place where you're talking about criminal abuse of a child, right? And this is why you have truancy officers, right? So those are vulnerable people. But the solution has never been and can never be the government getting involved to the extent where they just pour money into an area and say, okay, here's some money, now it's solved. We pour money into inner city schools all the time, and it doesn't do anything because you're not changing the underlying effect. You're also not changing the fact that people are living in communities that have different value systems, and this is true for black and white. It's not specific to black communities. There are white rural communities that are like this too. The only way to overcome educational imbalances is number one, to give parents more freedom of choice to move their kids around. And number two, to give more local control so that it's not the feds deciding. And number three, to actually have social institutions and social penalties for not governmental penalties, social penalties, social disapproval for people who are not doing what they ought to do for their kids. There should be guilt involved when you don't take care of your kid. And a lot of government activity is designed to relieve that guilt, right? I'm not feeding my kid, so the government will feed my kid. And I shouldn't feel guilty about it. The government's going to feed my kid. You should absolutely feel guilty and like a bad person if you're not feeding your kid.
Thank you very much.
I've been seeing, I'm in my freshman year right now, and during the time I was seeing all this, I would be afraid to go to college and waste my application.
Yeah.
Have to deal with that. So, and like witnessing all that, it just seemed to be getting worse and worse.
Yeah, it's gotten worse in the last couple of years for sure.
So, what do you think, like I came with my friends were saying that, and like, our last meeting, we literally said, like, we don't even think the administration would allow us to get a speaker like you or Milo.
Well, I mean, they did, and I want to thank the administration for that. So thank you to the administration for allowing that. But yeah, I mean, it's...
I'm talking about my campus.
Oh, your campus. Which campus are you?
St. Edward's.
St. Edward's. Okay.
But basically, since it does seem like it's getting worse, do you think what do you think we should do?
Well, I mean, I think that you should, I think that, again, social guilt is a very powerful force, and DePaul is going to have to back off their ban, right? I mean, like, I think that a lot of these universities, when they're exposed to the light of day, sunlight is a great disinfectant. So if you apply to have a speaker like me, and your university refuses it, just get me the information, and I'll have you on Fox News that night.
So I do consider myself a member of the left, but I do like
Thanks for coming again.
I like listening to you, just like I like listening to Milo, whom I think you should debate at some point. I like listening to people from all over the spectrum, so I can have a better idea of where I stand, and so I can take information, be objective about it. I find myself agreeing with a lot of the things your friend Dave Rubin says, where you're as annoyed by the people who think everything is racist and everything is sexist as you are by the people who want to kick out immigrants. I think most people that I meet and speak to are somewhere in the middle, where you don't want to fit yourself into any narrative. I think there are a lot of people like that, and I think society right now is in a place where everybody just wants to be extreme. You either want to assume that everybody's racist or nobody's.
Yes, and that's true.
Whereas I think they're not being honest with themselves. Do you think, in your honest opinion, there's a way we can, as a society, come forward and sort of bridge those people together?
Yes, I think most people, and this is why I keep coming back to the individual versus grouping. And when I say left and right, I'm using these as shorthand for political viewpoints. But I'm not talking about necessarily people, unless I cite a specific person who is of the left because this is their view. But the fact is that the only way that we're going to be able to come together is around certain instances of injustice. Individual justice is actually really a pretty simple thing for people to agree on. It's when you get to this stupid concept of social justice. Social justice is the opposite of individual justice because justice doesn't need a modifier. Right? Social justice is the idea that O.J. Simpson should have been let off because something bad happened with Rodney King. Right? That's not individual justice, that's social justice. Social justice is the idea that your membership in an identity group means more than your responsibility for your own actions. When it comes down to individual responsibility, I think most people largely agree on what people should be responsible for on an individual level. And then when you see somebody do something bad, right and left, we all go, okay, well that person ought to be punished. And when someone does something good, I think we all right and left say that person ought to be rewarded. There should be a reward attached to that, and there usually is. The problem that I see is when all of that is obscured by an attempt at tribal identity, and you see this even on the right sometimes from the alt-right crowd, for example. I think that it's really negative when you allow group identity to overwhelm individual rights and individual scenarios. The bridge is going to be how we treat each other as individuals, which is why I always keep coming back to decency.
Thank you.
Hello, Ben. Nice to talk to you. It's like a real-life mailbag. So I have a question for you. Something I always struggle with understanding is the left's embrace of Islam. Because here you have, in political Islam, an ideology that is fundamentally opposed to so much what the left purports, yet you see the left increasingly promote, on a scale of, like, it happens in Europe with BBC News, it happens with our mainstream media with CNN, constantly putting out pro-Islam fluff pieces, etc. And I think this is related. The increasing criticism among particularly our cultural figures of Israel and growing anti-Israel sentiment. I've seen it on campus when people just try to voice appreciation for the country of Israel. There will be Marxists that come after them. The sort of
there's a reason Bernie Sanders is very anti-Israel.
The Islamic organizations come to protest as well, of course. What motivates this line?
So it all comes back to, all you have to remember about the left, really, when it comes down to it, is that fairness and outcome idea. So what happens is, think about it from the perspective that that's your only priority. And you look at the world today, and what you see is that the wealthy countries are all Western European countries steeped in Judeo-Christian civilization, or at least raised in Judeo-Christian civilization if they've moved away from it. And then Islamic countries are dirt poor, right? The people there are in serious trouble. They have leadership that's absolutely awful, authoritarian, brutal to women, brutal to homosexuals, just awful across the board. And what the left sees when they see that is not, why are those governments doing that to those poor people? Or why is this philosophy of radical Islam doing that to impoverish women and children? Like, why are they doing that? What the left instead sees is, hey look, the rich person, the poor person, the rich person screwed the poor guy. Right? It's colonialism, it was imperialism, the West was colonialist and imperialist, they were too powerful, that's why these other countries are poor. Saudi Arabia is poor, even though it's not really. Saudi Arabia is poor because of the West. The Palestinians are poor because of Israel, right? It's always in opposition to something. It's never maybe the Palestinians are poor because their leadership keeps stealing all their money and they keep voting for terrorists, right? Like that would probably be a better explanation as to why they're consistently poor and engaging in terrorism. But instead of looking at the responsibility of the people who are actually making the decisions, they look to the global inequality. That's why they focus on things like the same drive that leads them to focus on income inequality as opposed to how do we make life better for poor people. Those are two separate questions, right? Income inequality is a stupid idea because who cares if one guy's rich and one guy's poor? I only care if the guy who's poor is poor. I'd like him to be richer, right? But the left sees a fixed pie in the world, and therefore if one group is poor and one group is rich, the rich screw the poor. So there's a heroic poverty to the Islamic world that the left identifies with. And that overcomes all of their objections about the radicalism. In fact, they blame the radicalism on us, right? The radicalism isn't the fault of Islam or radical Islam. The radicalism is our fault for having victimized these poor Islamic people, and then they've been relegated to poverty and brutality because of us. This is why President Obama goes on an apology tour right after he's elected. Because the idea is if you just relieve that notion that America is the big bad Satan, then everything will be all better, and if we redistribute resources, things will be all better. That's why the left identifies on a consistent basis with some of the worst people on earth.
Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming. I appreciate hearing you speak. And I try not to subscribe to any ideology, and that's why I like listening to you, because I think you're actually going back to traditional conservatism instead of,
Well, thank you.
well, you know what I'm talking about. But what I wanted to ask is, America always, in the past century at least, always seems to search for some kind of opposition, whether it be Germany and then the Soviet Union, which is obvious and correct. But then we meddled in South America, and then we did the former Yugoslavia, and then the most recent thing is, and the most recent proclamation is the war on terror. And I wanted your take. What do you think we should do moving forward with this?
With regard to the war on terror?
Yes.
I mean, look, the war on terror is a civilizational struggle against radical Islam. And failing to recognize that is our first mistake. Because if you pretend in a way, then that's not going to help. That being the case, I think that you have to take each situation differently. So when it comes to global terror networks, obviously killing the leadership is the top priority. Then you have to talk about, and here I do think that Donald Trump, and this is actually Ted Cruz's plan originally, is correct when he says that you have to ensure that people who are coming into the country are not associated in any way with radicalism. You have to make sure that you've protected your own borders. And then you have to try and find good guys and enable them. That doesn't mean that you can intervene everywhere. That does mean that where you can intervene, and it's worthwhile in a cost-benefit analysis to do so, you should. But it's going to be a long struggle. Is it something the real question is it something we take seriously or not? If it's something we don't take seriously, then we can do sort of pinprick operations and pretend it's not a big deal. If it's something you take seriously, there are two possible solutions. One is the George W. Bush solution, which is you go in and you invade a country, and then you basically take it over for 30, 40 years, and you stay there until it's good, right? Which is a possibility. We did it to Japan, right? We did it to Germany. We did it for South Korea, essentially. You can do that. The other possibility is what Clement, this guy named Angelo Codavia writes about this. He says the other possibility is that if the leadership of a country is enabling terrorism, you go in, you kill all of the leadership, you impose a Shah character. If that Shah falls, you go in and you kill the new leadership, you impose a new Shah character, and you just sort of do this cycle over and over. There are benefits and drawbacks to each of these possible solutions, but I don't think that the war on terror is even well named. Terror is a tactic. It is not a philosophy or an ideology. And as far as a global strategy to deal with it, it's a little bit too complex to answer with one sentence about bomb the shit out of them, as some people have suggested.
So you don't think, I'm sure that these two presidential candidates, which I don't think anyone really likes, they're not going to solve this, and that's why you're hoping for actual conservatives to...
Well, I mean, I don't think either of these two presidential candidates is solving anything. I mean, Hillary can't solve her way out of prison, and Donald Trump can't solve a simple multiplication table.
Yeah.
The problem with terror, and this is just going to be a reality, is that it is a bit of playing whack-a-mole. But most of it is going to, in the end, I do agree with the assessment that a lot of terrorism is funded by governments, and governments are the ones that are going to have to change if that terrorism is going to stop. And there have to be severe costs imposed for governments that fund terrorism, including the government of Iran.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. In regards to the police shooting, and you did a good job of pointing out how the left misuses some of these stats. And then and you cited some studies, specifically the one from the Harvard professor, Dr. Fryer. And I've read that study, and in that study he concludes that what it is that we don't have enough evidence and we don't have enough data. So do you ever worry that you might be misrepresenting the facts because we don't have all that data? And if so, like how do you...
Well, he did reach a conclusion based on the data set that he had. If the answer is that there are a bunch of racists who are hiding, in the non-data, I can't prove a negative.
No, but that was right. In certain cities, and even there, he doesn't know if those cities were willing to give him that data because they knew that they weren't targeting African Americans.
Right. So the question is, in the absence of data, and this is a decent question. In the absence of data, should we assume racism or should we not assume racism?
Right.
And
how do you guard against you just assuming what you're already biased towards?
so you look at each individual situation in isolation and you determine whether the situation bears the marks of racism or whether it doesn't. And the problem is that people immediately leap to a conclusion. So, and it actually does break down, unfortunately, along racial lines. Let's take an example, the shooting of Michael Brown in Missouri. Well, when that happened, there were polls that came out in the week after. And what they showed was that the vast majority of white people didn't say that the officer, Darren Wilson, was innocent. What they actually said, by and large, was we need more information, which is actually the proper response, right? Let's wait till all the information comes out, then we'll make a call as to whether something racist happening here. Something like in excess of 80% of the black community immediately declared him guilty. Said Darren Wilson committed a racist shooting because we've heard the earlier reports and that's enough for us to make a judgment. I think that it is worthwhile in the absence of data to hold off judgment. The problem is that BLM doesn't even do that. They immediately assume any situation is evidence of not just an individual cop who's racist, but systemic police bias. So if there's no evidence for systemic police bias, I can't assume that there is evidence of systemic police bias.
Yeah, you can't assume the opposite either.
Well, I can assume the absence of evidence. And in my view, before you call somebody racist, you better damn well have good evidence.
No, and I agree, but I just feel like on the other side, you might also be doing the thing on the other side where you're saying, hey, well, they're just completely wrong.
Well, based on the current data, they are completely wrong. When they present data that conflicts with that, then I'm happy to reconsider my position. But I'm not going to do it based on anecdotal evidence or my story about how I feel as a black person in America, because we all have stories where we feel bad. I'm sure black people have a lot of stories where they feel really bad about run-ins with law enforcement, but there's no way for anybody to check anybody's anecdotal work.
No, I agree, but do you agree that the data is there nationwide, so we can't say...
Well, I mean, listen, I'm definitely up for better data. I'd love if they would collect better data. The data that I see right now does not bear any resemblance to the case BLM was made.
Would you change your opinion if the data came out?
Yeah, I mean, of course. I mean, and new evidence bears changed opinions, that's all.
Okay, all right, so first of all, I think you would like completely destroy my line of debate. Like, second of all right, so how do you think that we could actually solve the problem with black communities? Because people I was actually at the affirmative action, I guess, protest last week, and I started to argue with a bunch of people, and they never actually proposed a solution that helps black people, or I guess black communities at home. What they said was, hey, send them to college, and that will help them. And how do you think that?
So when we talk, first of all, when we talk about the problem in black communities, I think that we have to be a little bit more specific, because there are lots of problems in lots of communities, and there are lots of problems in black communities that are not specific to black people. Again, the single motherhood rate in the white community was 5% in the 1960s. Today it's well in excess of 40%. That's a problem in the white community, right? I don't think it has anything to do with race. I think it has a lot to do with pathologies of culture that are negative, whether you're talking hillbilly elegy in J.D. Vance's book in Kentucky, or whether you're talking about the black community in South Central Los Angeles. So that said, the solutions aren't the same for everybody, right? And this is sort of the purpose of the speech. The solutions aren't the same for everybody. Don't have babies out of wedlock, go to school, get a job. The problem with affirmative action is it actually effectively does not allow people who benefit from affirmative action to go to schools where they can succeed. The dropout rate is significantly higher for affirmative action students. You're penalizing people based on their race, because the fact is that Colin Powell's kid benefits from affirmative action, but some poor schlub living in West Virginia who grows up really poor, and is white, that guy is being pushed out for Colin Powell's kid. You can't do it on the basis of color. And beyond that, if you actually want to create workable solutions, then hard work is the only way to do that. Now, one of the problems that we have in the United States now is that because we have so much information at our fingertips about how everybody else is doing in life, we all expect to rise to become Bill Gates in one generation. That's not how wealth works. The reality is that for pretty much everybody in this room, your grandparents were probably poorer than you are. And that's been true throughout human history. And when people grow up poor and then immediately want to be making and start in a worse situation than someone else, the immediate idea is something unfair has happened. Well, something unfair has happened, but that's not correctable by government. In the end, the keys to solving things in high crime black areas, for example, is you need more cops to police the crime and get the criminals out of the community. You need parents who are going to